Chicago, in winter. Snow drifted down in fine, scattered flurries, whitening the crowded streets. People hurried past one another, their necks tucked deep into their coats, their breath rising in pale white clouds that vanished almost at once into the piercing air. But there, at that busy street corner, everything suddenly stopped. People stood frozen, forgetting their next step, forgetting even the cold that was slicing into their skin, because before their eyes was a sight no one could believe. A tall man, dressed in an expensive black overcoat, was down on one knee on the dirty snow, the knee of his designer suit pants pressed into the wet, freezing slush, but he didn't seem to care. Standing before him were two children, two little ones, no more than 7 years old, thin and fragile inside their light coats, clutching an old wicker basket that held a few loaves of bread. That man was Brennan Cross, a name that could make all of Chicago shudder. The most powerful crime boss in the city, the man who held half of its underworld in his hands. The wealthy elite respected him. The criminal world feared him. Other mafia bosses lowered their heads when his name was spoken. For 20 years, Brennan Cross had never bowed to anyone. A gun had once been pointed at his head, and he had still stood straight, staring into the barrel without so much as a blink. He had faced the most dangerous enemies and remained as cold as ice in the heart of winter. No one, and nothing, had ever made this man yield. And yet today, in broad daylight, at a crowded street corner under dozens of watching eyes, Brennan Cross was kneeling before two children selling bread. Who were those two children? What had happened? Why was the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago in this position? What could make a man who had never bowed before the barrel of a gun fall to his knees before two 7-year-old children? The answer lay in what had happened 2 weeks earlier, a story of arrogance and awakening, of old wounds and the chance to heal, of two worlds that seemed as though they could never meet, yet collided in a way no one could have imagined. To understand this impossible moment, we have to turn back time to 2 weeks before, to another bitter winter morning, when it all began. If this story touches your heart, please press like to support us. Share this video with the people you love, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next moving stories. 2 weeks earlier, the south side of Chicago lay beneath a bleak gray morning. The sky hung low like a heavy blanket of lead, pressing down on the old buildings, the shadowed alleyways, and the fragile lives struggling to survive from one day to the next. On the 5th floor of a crumbling building, a tiny studio apartment sat at the very end of a dark hallway. Inside, the air was so cold it seemed to cut straight through the skin. The heater had been broken since the month before. The landlord had promised to fix it, but never came. Damp stains spread across the walls from corner to corner like wounds that would never heal. The windows shuddered whenever the wind pushed against them, and through every crack the cold came pouring in without mercy. The temperature inside was almost as bitter as it was outdoors. On the narrow bed pressed against the wall, Jenny Hartwell lay curled beneath a thin, fragile blanket. Her body trembled without stopping, a fever of 104 degrees burning through her from the inside out. Sweat had soaked the pillow and seeped clear through the worn old bedsheet beneath her. Her lips were dry and split, and now and then they moved faintly as she called someone's name in her delirium. Her chestnut-brown hair, once glossy and soft, was now tangled and plastered against her sweat-drenched forehead. Her gray eyes, once as clear as autumn lake water, had turned dull and hollow with exhaustion and illness. 28 years old. Looking at her there, no one would have believed she was still that young. Her face was gaunt, her cheekbones sharp, her skin pale and drained of life. In far too short a time, life had taken too much from her. 2 years earlier, Jenny had been a gifted chef at a 5-star restaurant in downtown Chicago. She had skilled hands, a sharp eye for every ingredient, and a fierce passion for food. She had a gentle husband named David, a construction worker, and 2 beautiful twin children. Their life wasn't wealthy, but it was full in all the ways that mattered. Then one day, everything fell apart. David was gone forever after a scaffolding collapse at a construction site in the center of the city. There was no goodbye, no final chance to tell his wife and children that he loved them. Jenny lost her husband, lost the pillar of her family, lost even her sense of direction in life. She left her job to care for the little ones. Their savings slowly ran dry, and her chronic kidney disease grew worse with each passing day. Now she made a living selling homemade bread, loaves shaped by hand from her grandmother's secret recipe, the only thing she still had left from the past. But for the last 3 days, the medicine had run out. There wasn't a single cent left, and her body could bear no more. By the doorway, the 2 children stood in silence, their eyes fixed on their mother. Mason Hartwell, 7 years old, had brown curls like his father and deep gray eyes like his mother. He was quiet, reserved, older in spirit than his years. On his back was a worn navy blue backpack, the only keepsake he had left of his father. He never let it leave him, not even when he slept. Beside Mason, Molly Hartwell stood clutching the sleeve of her brother's coat. She was also 7, Mason's identical twin, yet her nature was entirely different. Her long brown hair was tied into 2 neat braids, her eyes were made for smiling, and her face somehow kept its brightness in spite of everything. In her hand she carried an old teddy bear missing one eye, named Mr. Buttons, her closest companion since the day she was born. Jenny shifted weakly, trying to sit up. She pressed one hand against the bed and struggled to lift herself, but the dizziness came over her like a tidal wave. The room spun before her eyes. The walls seemed to sway and dance, and she fell back onto the bed, gasping for breath. She tried to open her mouth, her voice thin and fragile as a thread about to snap, calling for her children. Mason ran to her at once, Molly hurrying after him. The boy took his mother's hand, his own small, warm palm resting against her forehead, which burned like fire. Jenny whispered in a broken voice, asking them to bring her some water. Mason turned away, poured water from the pitcher into a cup, and lifted it to her lips. Jenny drank in small sips, as though each swallow held the last of her strength. After their mother drifted back into sleep, Mason stood up and looked around the tiny apartment. His eyes came to rest on the corner of the kitchen, where a wicker basket held 15 loaves of bread their mother had made the night before. She was supposed to deliver them today, but she couldn't even rise from bed. The boy looked at the bread, then back at his mother, then out the window where the snow was falling. A decision formed in his mind, clear and certain. He would take the bread downtown and sell it. He would earn money to buy medicine for his mother. He had to do it, because there was no one else. Molly saw her brother putting on his coat and asked where he was going. Mason explained, in only a few words, that he was going to sell the bread. Molly immediately said she was going too. She refused to stay home alone with their sick mother. Mason wanted to say no, wanted her to stay where it was safer, but when he looked into his sister's determined eyes, he knew he couldn't stop her. The 2 of them put on their coats together. Thin little coats that weren't nearly enough for the cruel Chicago winter. Mason pulled an old knit cap down over his sister's head, then lifted the collar of his own coat high around his neck. He picked up the basket full of bread. It was heavy for the small body of a 7-year-old boy, but he didn't complain once. Before they stepped out, Mason turned back to look at his mother sleeping on the bed. Her face was pale, her breathing labored, a faint moan slipping from her lips through the haze of fever. The boy tightened his grip on the basket handle, as though he were holding on to every bit of courage he had. He turned to his sister, his voice soft but steady, and said that they'd come back soon, that their mother would get better. Molly nodded and hugged Mr. Buttons tightly against her chest, her eyes filled with absolute trust in her brother. The apartment door closed behind the 2 children. Their small footsteps sounded over the creaking wooden stairs, one step at a time, down 5 dark and filthy flights. Then the building door opened, and the cutting cold of Chicago in December rushed over their tiny bodies. Snow drifted lightly. The wind blew sharp and hard. But the 2 children didn't turn back. They kept walking, step after step, toward the far-off downtown, where the glittering towers rose like another world entirely. Inside the freezing apartment, Jenny still lay there, lost in her delirium. She didn't know that her 2 small children had gone out into the cold. She didn't know what they were facing beyond those walls. All she knew was that, in the broken fragments of her dream, she saw David smiling at her, and everything seemed peaceful. But outside, on the snow-covered streets of Chicago, 2 7-year-old children were stepping into a journey that would change their lives forever. And they had no idea that, within the next few hours, they would come face to face with one of the most dangerous men in the city. The 2 children walked through the streets of Chicago in the skin-cutting cold of December. Snow drifted down in light flurries, each tiny flake settling on their shoulders, on their hair, then melting into cold droplets that soaked through the fabric. Outside, the temperature had fallen to 5 below zero, the kind of bitter cold that turned every breath into white smoke, numbed the lips, and slowly stole all feeling from the fingers. The sky was gray and lifeless, like an enormous burial shroud stretched across the whole city, with not a single ray of sunlight strong enough to break through. From the heart of the South Side to downtown was nearly 2 kilometers on foot, a grueling distance for 2 small children in a blizzard. For an adult, it was a walk of a little more than 20 minutes. For 2 7-year-old children, in weather like this, it was a long and punishing journey. Mason walked in front, carrying the heavy wicker basket in one hand, his shoulders drawn tight from the cold. The soles of his shoes were worn thin, and melted snow had seeped inside, soaking each toe in icy wetness. But he didn't stop, didn't complain, only kept moving one step at a time. Behind him, Molly stayed close, one arm wrapped around Mr. Buttons, the other gripping the edge of Mason's coat. One finger of her knitted glove had torn open, leaving her index finger exposed, red and raw from the cold. Even so, she kept doing her best to keep up with her brother, unwilling to make Mason worry. When the 2 children finally reached downtown, the scene before them was nothing like the place they came from. Skyscrapers rose into the sky like giants made of glass and steel, gleaming beneath the city lights even though it was still daytime. Luxury cars glided along the streets, Mercedes, BMWs, Porsches, and now and then a Rolls-Royce appeared like some rare and magnificent beast. The people passing by were dressed with effortless elegance, expensive wool coats wrapped around them, cashmere scarves at their throats, striding quickly with cell phones pressed to their ears or cups of hot coffee in their hands. This was the world of the wealthy, a world that 2 children from the South Side had never belonged to. Mason looked around, searching for the best place to stand and sell. His eyes settled on a busy corner near a massive black glass tower that thrust straight into the sky. It was Cross Tower, 40 stories of stern grandeur, the headquarters of Cross Holdings. The boy had no idea what kind of building it was. He only knew that many well-dressed people were going in and out, and people like that surely had money to buy bread. The 2 children stopped at the corner and set the basket down in front of them. Molly began calling out to passers-by, her clear little voice trembling from the cold as it rose into the endless stream of people. She asked them to buy some bread, telling them it was delicious, that their mother had made it herself, that it was still warm, still fragrant. Mason stood beside her without speaking, simply watching the street around them like a tiny guard on duty, ready to protect his sister if anything happened. 1 hour passed. No one bought a thing. People walked by and cast all kinds of looks at the 2 children. Some seemed pitying, then kept moving. Some shook their heads as if the children were nothing but an inconvenience. Some didn't even bother to look at all, stepping past as though the children didn't exist. One woman in an elegant business suit stopped, studied them for a moment, then walked away without a word. A man holding a Starbucks coffee glanced down at the basket of bread, frowned, and turned aside. Molly kept calling out patiently, her smile still there even though her lips had turned purple from the cold. Mason remained where he was, silent, his eyes growing a little more hardened with every fresh act of indifference. About 20 meters from the corner, a black Maybach S-Class sat parked by the curb, polished to a mirror shine. Its glossy paint reflected the falling snow, its alloy wheels glimmered, and its dark-tinted windows revealed nothing of the world inside. The engine purred softly, keeping the cabin at a perfect warmth, completely sealed off from the brutal cold outside. Inside the car, Brennan Cross sat in the rear seat, his eyes moving over a financial report on his iPad. 33 years old, 6'2", with the solid, honed build of a man who trained regularly. His black hair was brushed straight back without a single strand out of place, and the beard along his jaw had been trimmed to perfect precision, sharpening the hard lines of a face built for power. But the most striking thing about him was his eyes, steel blue, cold as ice in the dead of winter, sharp enough to cut through anything they settled on. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much, done too much, and had reached a place where nothing could make him afraid anymore. Brennan wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a black tie, covered by a black cashmere overcoat that cost more than a middle-class family might spend on rent in 5 years. On the little finger of his left hand was a silver ring engraved with a stylized cross, the symbol of the Cross Syndicate, the shadow organization he commanded. On the surface, Brennan Cross was the chief executive officer of Cross Holdings, one of Chicago's leading real estate and financial corporations. But people in the know understood that his empire stretched much farther than that, descending deep into the darkest underlayers of the city. He controlled half of Chicago's underworld, from secret casinos to shadowed financial operations no one spoke of aloud. High society respected him. The criminal world feared him, and everyone knew it was dangerous to stand in Brennan Cross's path. In the front passenger seat, Jared Hollis was giving a report on an important deal. 35 years old, broad and solid, with a hard-featured face marked by a faint scar on his chin. Jared was Brennan's right hand, a man who had served him with absolute loyalty for 10 years. He spoke about numbers, about risks, about the next steps ahead. Brennan listened, giving an occasional nod or asking a brief question. His voice was deep and cold, every word carefully weighed before it left his mouth. Brennan Cross lived by a simple philosophy. There were only two kinds of people in this world, the strong and the prey. There was no room for weakness, no room for pity. A man was either the hunter or the hunted. He had chosen to be the hunter when he was still very young, and he had never once regretted it. Brennan's gaze shifted through the car window, taking in the street outside. His eyes paused for the briefest moment at the corner, where the two children stood huddled beside their basket of bread. He looked at them, two tiny creatures shivering in the cold, trying to call out to passers-by who never spared them a thought. His eyes passed over them as casually as if they were two objects too small to matter, like leaves blown across the sidewalk or snowflakes melting against the glass. Then he turned back to the report and continued listening to Jared talk about the deal. The two children outside meant nothing to Brennan Cross. They belonged to another world, the world of the weak, the world of prey, and he never concerned himself with prey, unless it happened to stand in his way. But fate has strange ways of arranging its meetings, and in only a few minutes more, two worlds that should never have touched were about to collide in a way none of them could have imagined. Jared had just finished his report when Brennan folded the iPad shut and glanced at the watch on his wrist. The meeting with the shareholders would begin in 15 minutes. He instructed the driver to pull the car to the main entrance of the building. The Maybach eased forward, smooth and silent as some great beast in motion, making its way toward Cross Tower. As the car approached the corner, the driver slowed for the traffic light. The Maybach came to a stop at the exact spot where the two children were standing, trying to sell their bread. Brennan lowered the window a narrow crack, his eyes sweeping quickly over the sidewalk to assess the situation outside, a habit of a man who had spent too many years in the underworld, where vigilance had become a survival instinct. Molly saw the window come down. Her eyes lit up as though she had caught a glimmer of hope in the middle of a snowstorm. The glossy black car was larger and more beautiful than anything she had ever seen in the South Side. In the mind of a 7-year-old child, the logic was simple. A car that beautiful meant the person inside surely had money. A person with money could buy bread. If they bought bread, she would have money to buy medicine for her mother. Without a moment of hesitation, Molly ran to the car, her little shoes crunching over the snow. She stopped beside the door, her tiny hand tapping softly against the dark glass. Her clear little voice rose through the sound of the wind, pleading with the person inside to please buy some bread, telling him that her mother had made it, that it was so good, so fragrant, that he should please buy some. She lifted the worn container as high as she could, so the person inside would be able to see the loaves. The smile on Molly's face was bright and innocent, untouched by fear, as though she were speaking to a friend and not standing before one of the most dangerous men in all of Chicago. Brennan lowered the window a little farther, just enough to see the child clearly. His eyes settled on Molly's face, studying her without emotion, as if he were looking at some lifeless object by the roadside. He saw the little hands reddened by the cold, fingers nearly numb but still clinging tightly to the basket handle. He saw the thin coat, worn and frayed at the shoulder, nowhere near enough for weather like this. He saw the pale cheeks, the lips gone purple from the cold, and still she kept trying to smile. He saw the worn container, worn through at the corners, holding loaves of bread that were no longer warm. The faint scent of bread drifted through the narrow opening in the window. The humble smell of flour and yeast, strangely out of place amid the scent of fine leather and expensive cologne inside the car. For a few seconds, there was silence. Molly kept smiling, kept holding the basket up, kept waiting. She didn't understand why the man inside was looking at her that way, cold and distant, as though she were something unpleasant that had wandered into his line of sight. Brennan finally spoke, his voice cold and slow, each word falling like a stone, asking her what she wanted. Molly didn't flinch. She kept her bright smile and raised the basket even higher. She said she was selling bread, that her mother had made it yesterday, that it still smelled wonderful, that he should please buy one loaf. It was only $3, and it was really delicious. Her voice was clear and full of hope, like the ringing of a tiny bell in the middle of a bitter winter day. Brennan looked at the child, looked at the worn old basket of bread, then gave a short, mocking laugh. It was brief, cold, without the slightest hint of warmth. It was the laugh of contempt, of dismissal, of a man looking at something utterly unworthy of his time. He looked at Molly the way a man might look at weak prey, a creature with no place in his world. In Brennan Cross's mind, these two children were the very image of weakness, the kind of thing he had spent his whole life teaching himself to rise above. He felt no pity, no compassion, no stirring of emotion at the sight before him, only the irritation of a man being inconvenienced. Brennan said nothing more to Molly. He turned to the driver, his voice as cold as ice, and ordered him to send the child away, telling him that he didn't have time for this nonsense. The driver, a large man with broad shoulders and a hard expression, nodded and obeyed at once. He opened the car door, stepped out, and slammed it shut behind him. Molly startled at the sound and stepped back, her eyes widening as she looked at the man coming toward her. She didn't understand what was happening. She didn't understand why the man inside hadn't bought the bread. She didn't understand why this man was walking toward her with that look on his face. All she knew was to clutch the basket tightly against her chest, as though it were the only thing that could protect her in that moment. From behind, Mason saw someone moving toward his sister. At once, he left his spot and ran toward Molly, his worn shoes slipping across the snow. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the fierce rising instinct to protect. He had to get to his sister before something bad happened. He had to protect her, no matter who stood in front of them. And in that moment, as Mason ran toward his sister, as Brennan Cross's driver came closer to the two children, everything was about to shatter in a way none of them could have imagined. The driver stepped up in front of Molly, his large frame casting a shadow over the tiny child like a tower. Without a word of warning, without a second of hesitation, he struck out with one sharp motion. His broad hand slammed into the basket, and the strength of a grown man was enough to send it flying out of Molly's small hands. Everything happened too fast, and yet for Molly, that moment stretched on without end. She watched the basket leave her hands, spinning in the air, then crash down onto the dirty snow by the curb. The loaves of bread rolled out, one after another, like dreams breaking apart. One rolled into a pool of black water and soaked through with mud and filth. One was crushed beneath the foot of a passerby who didn't even bother to look down, but simply kept walking. One rolled into a drainage gutter and disappeared into the foul dark below. The loaves her mother had made the night before, the loaves she had carried nearly 2 kilometers through the freezing cold, the loaves that were their only hope of buying medicine for their mother, now lay scattered across the dirty snow like worthless trash. Molly stood frozen in the middle of the corner. Her hands were still raised, her fingers still curved as though they were holding the basket handle, as if her body had not yet understood that the thing she was carrying was gone. Her eyes were wide, dazed, unable to make sense of what had just happened. Why would someone do that? Why would someone knock her bread to the ground? She only wanted to sell bread. She only wanted to buy medicine for her mother. She hadn't done anything wrong. The question spun through the mind of a 7-year-old child, but no answer came. Mason ran up and stopped directly in front of his sister. He stood there, his small body planted between her and the glossy black Maybach, as though he could shield her from everything. He didn't say a word. He didn't shout. He didn't cry or beg. He only stood there, his eyes fixed on the dark window of the car, where he knew someone was sitting inside. There was no fear in that gaze, no panic. Only a terrible silence, a kind of strength that did not belong in a 7-year-old child. It was the look of someone who had endured too much, lost too much, and had nothing left to lose. Inside the car, through the dark glass, Brennan Cross caught that look. He looked at the boy, a thin child trembling in the bone, chilling cold, wearing a coat too light to keep him warm, shoes worn down and soaked through with melted snow. A tiny creature with nothing in his hands except a few loaves of bread that were now lying in the street. But the boy's eyes, those eyes like steel, looked straight at Brennan without blinking. No fear, no pleading, no hatred, only a steady stare. Silent, defiant. Something flickered through Brennan then, something strange, as though something sharp had pierced a place deep inside him that he had long believed was dead. The feeling unsettled him, as if the boy's eyes were cutting through the armor he had spent so many years building around himself. But Brennan Cross never allowed anything to rule him. He brushed the feeling aside at once, unsaid a way a man might brush a fly from his shoulder. Brennan ordered the driver to move on, his voice cold and flat, empty of feeling. The driver returned to the car at once and shut the door. The Maybach surged forward, its tires grinding over the snow, gliding away as smoothly as if nothing had happened. The black car merged into the flow of traffic and disappeared beyond the corner, leaving the two children standing in the frozen street. People passing by stopped and stared for a few seconds. Some whispered to one another. Some shook their heads as though they had witnessed something unfortunate, but nothing that had anything to do with them. Some even stepped over the loaves lying on the ground without bothering to look down. But no one, not a single person, stopped to help. No one asked if the two children were all right. No one bent down to gather the bread. They only looked, then turned away, and went on with their lives as though those two children did not exist. Molly still stood there, her hands now hanging limp at her sides. Her lips began to tremble, not only from the cold, but from something rising up inside her chest. Her eyes turned red with tears, the tears gathering and threatening to spill, though she fought to hold them back. She didn't cry, because her brother was there, because she didn't want to make him worry even more. But her throat tightened, as though a stone had lodged there. Mason looked at her for 1 second, then turned away without saying a word. He knelt down onto the freezing snow, his knees sinking into the wet and filthy slush, and began gathering the bread one loaf at a time. One by one, he picked them up, brushing away the snow, brushing away the dirt, checking whether they could still be eaten. The loaves that were still whole, he placed back into the basket. The ones that were ruined, soaked through with dirty water, he set aside, his face filled with pain he never gave a voice to. His hands were red from the cold, his fingers almost numb, but he kept going, slowly, patiently, silently. Molly looked down and saw Mr. Buttons lying in the snow. Her old teddy bear had fallen without her even noticing. Perhaps when the driver's sudden blow had made her jump, she bent down, picked him up, brushed the snow from his worn fur, and held Mr. Buttons tightly against her chest, as though she were holding her dearest friend. The teddy bear was torn and missing one eye, its stuffing long gone flat, but it was still the most precious thing she owned. In a small, trembling voice, close to tears, she asked her brother if they were going home now. Mason lifted his head and looked at her, his eyes quiet and deep as a winter lake. Then he looked down into the basket and quickly counted the loaves that could still be sold. 5 were left, not enough money to buy their mother's medicine. He shook his head and told her, no, not yet. They still didn't have enough money to buy medicine for Mom. They had to sell all the bread first. Molly said nothing more. She nodded, her eyes still red, but not a single tear fell. The two children got to their feet and brushed the snow from their clothes. Mason picked up the basket, half of the bread inside now damp, and took his sister's hand with the other. Then the two of them walked away, leaving the corner where they had just been humiliated, making their way toward another street corner, to keep selling, to keep hoping, because their mother was waiting at home, because the medicine had to be bought, because they had no other choice. The two small figures moved quietly through the crowded streets of downtown Chicago, tiny and lost like 2 dry leaves swept into the path of a waterfall. No one saw them. No one cared. But from a small cafe on the opposite corner, one pair of eyes had witnessed everything, and those eyes could not turn away. Right across the street corner, Morrison's Corner Cafe sat quietly between the elegant high-rises. It was a small place, with an old-fashioned charm, its wide front windows looking out onto the street, its interior warm with soft golden light, and the gentle, lingering scent of freshly roasted coffee. The cafe had stood there for 20 years, a peaceful little refuge in the restless rush of downtown Chicago. And its owner, Clyde Morrison, had spent all those years behind the counter. Clyde was 67 years old, with hair as white as the winter snow outside, and a face lined with the marks of a man who had lived through too many storms. He was tall and lean, his back still straight from his years in the military, his deep brown eyes weary and shadowed, yet still bright with sharp intelligence. He was a veteran of the Vietnam War, a man who had seen things ordinary people would never want to see, a man who had done things that still returned to haunt his sleep at night. His wife had died 15 years earlier from a sudden heart attack, leaving him alone in a house filled with silence. And his daughter, Emily, had left this world 10 years before, when cancer took her at the age of 23. Clyde stood behind the counter, a white towel in his hand as he polished a glass. But his eyes weren't on the glass. They were fixed on the window, staring out at the street. He had seen everything. From the moment the gleaming black Maybach stopped at the corner, to the instant the little girl with braids ran up and tapped on the window, to the moment the driver stepped out and struck the basket from the child's hands, to the second the car pulled away without a trace of feeling. He had seen the boy kneel in the dirty snow to gather the bread one loaf at a time. He had seen the girl standing there in stunned silence, clutching her torn teddy bear. He had seen all of it, and his hand had tightened around the edge of the counter until his knuckles turned white. His jaw had locked, the muscles in his cheek jumping as he fought to keep his anger under control. He knew that car. In downtown Chicago, anyone who did business knew Brennan Cross's Maybach. That name people whispered with fear in their voices. The head of the Cross Syndicate, the man who controlled half the city's underworld, the man even the police treated with caution. But Clyde Morrison wasn't afraid. He had faced death in jungles half a world away. He had stared into the barrels of enemy guns without trembling. One gangster, no matter how powerful, wasn't enough to frighten him. What enraged him wasn't Brennan Cross or his organization. What made the blood rise hot in his veins was the needless cruelty shown to two innocent children. They were only two little kids trying to sell bread. What had they done wrong? Clyde set the glass and towel down on the counter and stepped out of the cafe. The December cold hit his face at once, but he paid it no mind. He walked toward the new street corner where the two children were standing, hunched over their damp basket of bread. They were still trying to call out to passing strangers, but no one stopped. The little girl's voice still rose now and then, asking people to buy some bread, but it was weaker than before, more fragile, more shaken. Clyde stopped in front of them, and in a voice warm and deep, as wood crackling in a winter fire, he told them to come into his cafe, because standing out in weather like this wasn't good for them. Mason looked up at the stranger, his protective instincts rising at once. He stepped slightly to one side, placing himself between the old man and his sister, his eyes guarded and alert. He had met enough adults that day, and none of them had been kind to him or to Molly. Why should this man be any different? But when he looked into Clyde's eyes, Mason saw something different there. The old man's gaze held none of the cheap pity he had seen from people passing on the sidewalk. There was none of the cold contempt he had seen in the man inside the black car. There was no prying curiosity. There was only real concern, warm and steady, like the eyes of the grandfather in the stories their mother used to tell. Mason hesitated for a moment, looked at his sister trembling from the cold, looked down at the wet basket in his hand, then gave a quiet nod. The two children followed Clyde into Morrison's corner cafe. When the glass door closed behind them, the warmth rushed around them like a mother's embrace. Inside, the air was filled with the scent of roasted coffee and fresh-baked pastries, and the soft golden lights made the whole place feel safe and welcoming. Old photographs hung on the walls. One showed a young man in uniform standing deep in the jungle. One showed a blonde woman with a gentle smile. Another showed a beautiful young woman laughing on the day of her college graduation. They were pieces of Clyde's memory, the fragments left behind from a life that had already passed. Clyde led the two children to a table near the fireplace and told them to sit there and get warm. Then he went behind the counter and made 2 mugs of hot cocoa with a thick swirl of whipped cream on top. He set the mugs in front of them without saying anything more, without asking questions right away. He understood that sometimes what people needed most wasn't a question, but silence and something warm to hold in their hands. Molly looked at the cocoa, then looked up at Clyde with uncertain eyes. He gave her a small, encouraging nod, and she took a sip. The sweet warmth spread from her tongue down into her throat, into her chest, and through her frozen little body. Her eyes lit up, and she exclaimed that it was so good, so warm. Mason drank too, but one hand still held tightly to the handle of the wet basket resting by his feet, as though he were afraid that if he let go, he would lose the only thing he still had. Clyde sat down in the chair across from them and looked at the two children with a gentle gaze. He asked softly, not like an interrogation, not with urgency, only because he wanted to understand so he could help. The children told him the story in simple pieces. Molly spoke more, her little voice clear and soft, while Mason added a few short sentences now and then. Their mother was sick. The medicine was gone. They needed money to buy more, so they had brought the bread out to sell it. Childish words, simple and direct, yet carrying the weight of a tragedy no child should ever have to bear. Clyde listened, and his heart ached. He looked at Molly, with those clear, bright eyes as she spoke, and he saw Emily. His daughter had once had eyes just like that, full of innocence and life, before cancer stole it all away. He looked at Mason, with that hard-won strength far older than his years, and he saw himself at 12, after his own father had died, and he had been forced to become the one his family leaned on. Clyde offered to help. He told them to give him their address, and he would bring medicine to their mother himself. But Mason shook his head at once, his small voice quiet yet firm as steel. He said, "Thank you, sir. You're very kind, but I don't need anyone's pity. I just need to sell all this bread." Clyde looked at the boy and fell silent for a long moment. In Mason's eyes, he saw fierce pride, the kind of pride that could become strength, but could also become a chain. He had seen that same thing in himself many years before, when he had refused all help after the war and nearly drowned in whiskey and darkness. Clyde spoke again, his voice low and unhurried, each word carefully chosen. He told the boy, "You know, son, I've lived long enough to learn one thing. The strongest person isn't the one who never needs help. It's the one who knows when to accept it, and knows how to say thank you without feeling ashamed." Mason looked at him and said nothing, but something in the boy's eyes shifted, as though he were turning the old man's words over in his mind. Clyde went on, his voice still warm, but carrying the weight of a man who had suffered deeply. He said, "And there's one more thing, son. The strongest person isn't the one who never makes mistakes. It's the one who has the courage to admit when he's wrong, and the courage to kneel down and apologize when it's needed. That's real strength. Remember that, son." Molly sat beside her brother, sipping her cocoa and listening, nodding as if she understood, though perhaps not fully. Mason remained quiet, his eyes lowered to the steaming cup in his hands, while Clyde's words settled into him like seeds pressed gently into the earth, waiting for their season to grow. The boy didn't know that those words weren't meant for him alone. They were meant for another man as well, a man fate would one day bring to this little cafe, sooner than anyone imagined. That night, on the 40th floor of Cross Tower, Brennan Cross's penthouse lay steeped in darkness. The apartment stretched across more than 500 square meters, designed in a minimalist style with expensive furnishings, fine art on the walls, and an enormous glass wall overlooking the whole of Chicago at night. From there, the city spread out below like a glittering carpet of light, millions of tiny points shining and trembling against the distant waters of Lake Michigan. It was Brennan Cross's kingdom, the place where he stood at the summit and looked down on everything beneath him. Brennan stood before the glass wall, a tumbler of 30-year-old single malt whiskey in one hand, the amber liquid catching the glow of the city lights. But he didn't drink. The glass remained in his hand, untouched by his lips. It was well past midnight, yet Brennan wasn't the slightest bit sleepy. He was still wearing the same suit from that afternoon, only with his tie loosened and the top button of his shirt undone. His reflection hovered on the glass like a blurred portrait, his eyes fixed on the city, though it seemed he wasn't truly seeing any of it. Something was troubling his mind, like a small stone inside a shoe, not large enough to cause pain, but irritating enough that it couldn't be ignored. The boy's eyes, they kept rising before him, as clear as if the child were standing right there. Gray eyes, deep and unwavering, looking straight at him through the car window without blinking. No fear, no pleading, no hatred, none of the emotions an ordinary child would have shown after being treated that way. There was only silence, only that steady gaze, firm and unshaken, as if it could see straight through every layer of armor Brennan had spent years building around himself. Brennan took a sip of whiskey. The burn of it scorched his throat, but it wasn't enough to drive away that image. He found himself wondering why the stare of a 7-year-old boy selling bread was enough to rob him of sleep. He had faced the most dangerous enemies in Chicago, mafia bosses who could order a man killed without blinking, seasoned gunmen with death already hanging over their heads. He had stared down the barrel of a gun in tense negotiations and looked death in the eye without so much as a tremor. And yet tonight, he couldn't sleep because of the eyes of a little boy. It was absurd, completely absurd. And then, without warning, memory crashed over him like a tidal wave, sweeping away every wall he had ever built. Brennan at 6 years old, standing in the doorway of a sagging wooden house in one of Chicago's poorest outskirts. The boy wore an old, oversized t-shirt, his feet bare, his hair matted from too many days without a bath. In front of him, his mother stood holding a small suitcase, her purse in the other hand. She was a young woman with tired eyes and a face hollowed out by a life that had been too hard for too long. The boy called to her, asking where she was going. She didn't turn around. She walked toward the door, the suitcase dragging across the rotting wooden floor. The boy ran after her and called for her again, his voice beginning to shake, but she didn't stop. The door slammed shut in front of him, the sound of her footsteps fading across the porch and then disappearing altogether. The little boy stood there, one hand still lifted as though he were trying to reach after her, his eyes wide, unable to understand what had happened. His mother never came back. Brennan at 7, weak with hunger in an empty house. His father lay collapsed on the kitchen floor, surrounded by empty bottles rolling across the boards. He had been drunk for 3 days and still hadn't woken up. The boy searched the refrigerator. Nothing. He searched the cupboards. Nothing. He searched every corner of the house. Nothing except roaches and the smell of mildew. His stomach twisted in pain from hunger. His head spun from the emptiness inside him. He had to go out into the streets, beg for scraps behind restaurants, pick through the trash for leftovers behind diners and cafes. He learned how to chew stale bread one bite at a time, how to drink from public taps, how to sleep in hidden corners so no one would drive him away. And he told himself, his voice echoing in his own mind like a vow, "I'll become strong. I'll never be weak again. Never." Brennan at 10, standing in the kitchen with the shattered pieces of a cup at his feet. He had dropped it by accident while trying to reach a box of cereal on the top shelf. His father, newly awake from another drunken stupor, saw the broken pieces and came at him. No questions, no explanations. The man grabbed the boy by the collar and swung at him. The child fell to the floor, his cheek burning, his ears ringing, but he didn't cry. He looked straight into his father's eyes, his own eyes dry and empty, without fear, without pleading. Only a cold silence no child should ever have had. That night, after his father had passed out once more, the boy quietly gathered a few things into an old cloth bag and walked out of the house. He didn't look back. He never went back. Brennan opened his eyes and realized he was still standing before the glass wall, the whiskey glass trembling slightly in his hand. Cold sweat had broken across his forehead, even though the room was kept at a perfect warmth. Those memories had been buried long ago, sealed in a grave so deep no one could reach them. He had built his empire on a foundation of rage and resolve, turning suffering into strength, turning abandonment into the fuel that kept him from ever depending on anyone again. And yet tonight, all of it had risen back to the surface because of the eyes of a little boy selling bread. The boy's eyes were the same as his own had once been. Steady, unyielding, ready to protect the ones he loved at any cost. The child had stood there, small and trembling in the cold, yet he hadn't bowed his head. Just like Brennan at 10, standing before his father with a swollen cheek and not a single tear falling. Brennan set the whiskey down on the table and stepped out onto the balcony. The December wind struck his face, sharp as needles, but he felt nothing. He stood there with both hands gripping the railing, staring down at the city below. Millions of people were sleeping in their small homes. Millions of lives were unfolding beyond his reach, lives he neither knew nor cared about. He told himself they were only 2 children selling bread. They had nothing to do with him. He didn't owe them a thing. What he had done that day was no different from what thousands of other people would have done. It wasn't important. Forget it. Brennan turned back inside, shut the balcony door, and walked to his bed. He lay down, closed his eyes, and tried to force himself into sleep. But every time he shut his eyes, the boy's eyes appeared again, looking straight at him, silent and unwavering. That night, Brennan Cross didn't sleep. 3 days had passed since that morning. 3 days in which Brennan Cross had tried to forget the eyes of the little boy selling bread. 3 days in which he buried himself in work, in meetings, in deals, in the same cold decisions he had always made. But each night, when the penthouse sank into darkness and silence, those eyes returned, as vivid as if the boy were standing right there in the room. And each morning, Brennan woke feeling more exhausted than he had the night before. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Brennan sat in his private office on the 39th floor of Cross Tower. It was a vast room, furnished with a black oak desk, an expensive leather chair, and an entire wall of screens displaying footage from the building's security cameras. This was one of his habits, to control everything that happened within his territory. Every street corner around Cross Tower, every entrance and exit, every alley and parking lot, All of it lay within his sight. A man in his position couldn't allow anything to happen without knowing it. Brennan moved through the camera feeds, checking each one with mechanical precision. Main entrance, normal. Basement parking, normal. First floor hallway, normal. East corner, normal. Then he came to the north corner, the same place where his Maybach had stopped 3 days earlier. His finger was about to move on, but it stopped. The 2 children were still there, the same corner, the same worn wicker basket. For 3 days in a row, they had remained in that spot, from morning until evening, in the razor-sharp wind of a Chicago winter. Brennan zoomed in, and the image expanded across the screen. The curly-haired boy was still there, shoulders hunched against the cold, one hand gripping the basket of bread. The little girl with the braids was still smiling at each passerby, still calling out in that clear voice Brennan couldn't hear through the camera, yet could imagine all too easily. People still passed by. They still ignored them. They still shook their heads, or didn't even bother to look. But the children didn't give up. They kept trying. They kept hoping, as though every stranger passing by might be the one who would buy bread from them. Brennan sat there staring at the screen. Something inside him caught for a moment. Some feeling he couldn't even name. He didn't understand why he cared about these 2 children. They had nothing to do with him, nothing to do with his work, nothing to do with the empire he had built. He shouldn't have cared. This wasn't his concern. But their persistence, their refusal to quit even when they were ignored, even when they were freezing, even when they sold almost nothing, reminded him of something long buried. It reminded him of the 10-year-old boy he had once been, wandering the streets, digging scraps of food out of garbage bins, and never giving up. Never. Brennan lifted the phone from his desk and dialed an internal number. His voice was brief and cold, just as it always was, telling Jared to come to his office. A few minutes later, Jared Hollis stepped inside, his face calm as ever, ready to receive orders. Brennan didn't look up. His eyes remained fixed on the camera screen, but his voice rang out clearly. He told Jared to find out who those 2 children were, the ones selling bread on the north corner, where they lived, what their family situation was. Jared looked faintly surprised, one eyebrow tightening for the briefest second. In 10 years of working for Brennan Cross, he had never seen his boss take an interest in anything like this. Brennan Cross cared about money, power, and control, not 2 children selling bread on the street. But Jared didn't ask questions. He had learned long ago that when Brennan gave an order, the smart thing to do was obey. He simply nodded and said he'd have the answer within 24 hours, then turned and left the room. The next day, Jared came back into the office with a thin file in his hand. He placed it on the desk in front of Brennan, then stepped back and stood in silence, waiting. Brennan picked up the file and opened it. A few pages, a few photographs, a few dry numbers. Jenny Hartwell, 28 years old, widow, once a chef at a 5-star restaurant. Husband killed in a workplace accident 2 years earlier. Chronic kidney disease. No health insurance. 2 months behind on rent. Twin children. Mason and Molly Hartwell, 7 years old. Address, a dilapidated studio apartment in the South Side. Brennan turned the pages one by one, skimming the details. But he didn't need to read every line to understand. Behind those dry facts was a story he could already see with painful clarity. A young woman who had lost her husband, lost her health, lost nearly everything she had. But she hadn't lost her 2 children, and those 2 children were trying to save their mother in the only way they knew how, by taking bread into the street and selling it. Brennan closed the file and set it down on the desk. He said nothing. He only sat there in silence, staring into the empty space ahead of him. Jared stood there too, silent, but something was turning over in his own mind. Then he spoke, and his voice was different from the voice he used for business reports. It was lower, softer, touched by hesitation. He said that, boss, he had a 6-year-old daughter, and while he was reading that file, he kept thinking about her. Brennan looked up at him. It was the first time in 10 years that his right hand had spoken about something personal. Jared had never mentioned his family in any conversation, and Brennan had never asked. They worked together, but the line between business and private life had always remained firm, Jared went on, his voice dropping even lower, as though he were speaking more to himself than to his boss. He said that if one day he were gone, and his daughter had to stand in the street selling bread just to buy medicine for her mother, he didn't know what he would think. He didn't know if he could ever rest in peace knowing she had to live that way. Brennan didn't answer. He only sat there in silence, looking at the file on the desk. But he heard every word Jared said, and in his mind, the image of those two children standing and shivering on the corner came back again, clearer than ever. Jared remained there for another moment, then lowered his head, turned, and walked out of the office, leaving Brennan alone with the file and with thoughts he still didn't know what to do with. That night, close to midnight, Brennan Cross made a decision he couldn't fully explain, even to himself. He rose from his desk, leaving the file still lying on the surface of the black oak, and walked out of his office. He didn't call Jared. He didn't call his driver. He didn't bring any bodyguards with him. He went down alone to the garage, where a black Audi RS7 without license plates was parked. The car he used only when he wanted to go somewhere without anyone knowing. He slipped behind the wheel, started the engine, and drove out of Cross Tower into the dark. This was something Brennan Cross never did. The man who ruled half of Chicago's underworld didn't drive himself into dangerous neighborhoods without protection. It was one of the most basic rules of survival in his world. Always have someone covering your back. Always have a way out. Always control every variable. But tonight, he broke that rule. Tonight, he needed to be alone. He needed to face something he still couldn't name. Something that had been troubling him for days now, ever since he looked into the eyes of the little boy selling bread. The Audi moved through the brightly lit streets of downtown, then gradually entered darker neighborhoods as it headed toward the south side. The scenery changed little by little, from glittering towers of glass to crumbling low-rise buildings, from clean streets to roads full of potholes and scattered trash. The south side at night was a world entirely different from the downtown Brennan knew so well. Streetlights flickered, some already long dead and left unrepaired. Graffiti covered the walls, rough shapes and jagged letters, marking the territory of local gangs. The sound of barking dogs echoed out of narrow black alleys, mixed with the distant pulse of hip-hop drifting from some unseen house. The smell of garbage and damp rot hung in the freezing air. Brennan slowed the car when he reached the address listed in the file. He parked by the curb across from a weather-beaten 5-story building. Damp stains spread across the outer walls. The iron fire escape had rusted through in places. Some of the apartment windows had been covered with boards. This was where Jenny Hartwell and her 2 children lived. Brennan lifted his eyes to the 5th floor. A small window gave off a weak yellow light, the only light in the entire building at this hour. He shut off the engine, stepped out of the car, and stood on the sidewalk looking up at that apartment. The night wind cut through him, slipping past the expensive cashmere coat as though it weren't there, but he didn't care. He simply stood there in the darkness beneath a broken street lamp, staring up at the lit window. He had no intention of going upstairs. He didn't even know what he intended to do. He only needed to see it, needed to confirm that this place was real, that those 2 children were real, that the story in that thin little file wasn't just a collection of lifeless facts. Footsteps behind him. Brennan heard them before he saw them, the instinct of a man who had spent too many years in the underworld. He didn't turn at once. He remained still, measuring distance and number by sound alone. 3 men, coming closer, trying to move quietly, but not trained enough to hide it completely. Brennan turned slowly. 3 men stepped out of the alley, their heads covered with hoodies, their faces half swallowed by darkness. One held a metal pipe. The other 2 kept their hands in their pockets, perhaps carrying knives, perhaps not. A local gang, the kind that survived by robbing anyone foolish enough to wander into their territory. The one in front, clearly the leader, looked at the Audi RS7 parked by the curb with hungry eyes, then turned that same contemptuous look on Brennan. He spoke in a rough voice edged with threat, saying that was a nice car, pal, then asked what Brennan was doing down here at this hour, whether he was lost. Brennan stood still and said nothing. His eyes moved over the 3 men, assessing them quickly. Young, inexperienced, too confident. He had seen their kind hundreds of times in his life. The leader stepped closer, the metal pipe swinging loosely in his hand like a warning. His voice hardened as he told Brennan to hand over the car keys, and the wallet too, saying he didn't want trouble, and Brennan shouldn't want trouble either. Brennan remained silent. He looked straight into the man's eyes, without fear, without concern, without the slightest trace of tension. Then he smiled faintly, a cold and dangerous smile. The kind men in the underworld understood as the sign that real trouble was about to begin. In the space of a heartbeat, everything happened too fast for the 3 men to react. The leader swung the metal pipe at Brennan, but Brennan wasn't there anymore. He moved like a shadow, stepping aside with a speed too fast for the untrained eye to follow, then struck once, precise and merciless, at the man's throat. He didn't need a second blow. The man dropped to the ground like a sack, the pipe clattering across the sidewalk, unconscious before he even understood what had happened. The other two froze where they stood, their eyes wide with horror as they stared at their companion, lying motionless on the pavement. They didn't even have time to pull their hands from their pockets. They didn't have time to do anything at all. Brennan stood there, his breathing still calm, not a hair out of place, as though he had done nothing more than brush dust from his shoulder. He looked at the two remaining men, his eyes cold as ice, and spoke only a single word, his voice low as distant thunder. "Go!" And they went. They ran as if devils were chasing them, stumbling over the sidewalk, not daring to look back even once. In seconds, they had vanished into the darkness of the alley. Brennan stood alone on the sidewalk, looking down at the unconscious man at his feet. Beneath the flicker of the broken streetlight, he could see the young man's face clearly. Still young, perhaps not even 20. Thin-faced, pale-skinned, with an old scar across one cheek. A child who had grown up on the street, pushed by life into a corner, who had chosen the easiest road left to him in order to survive. Perhaps he too had once been a boy like Mason, years before poverty and despair turned him into a thief in the night. Brennan looked down at him for a long moment, then turned away and lifted his gaze once more to the 5th floor, and that was when he heard it. Through the fragile window, through the old loose panes rattling in the night wind, a clear little voice drifted down. A little girl's voice. Molly's voice. She was speaking to someone, probably her mother, and her voice was full of hope and determination. She said, "Mom, tomorrow I'll sell more, I promise. You're going to get better." That clear little voice rang through the stillness of the night and fell onto the sidewalk where Brennan stood like invisible tears. He stood there without moving, as though he had been nailed to the freezing concrete. The child's words cut through every layer of armor he had built over the years like the blade of a knife, driving straight into the place he had believed was dead long ago. He had said those words once, those exact words, many years before, when he had been a hungry 7-year-old boy standing in an empty house while his drunken father lay unconscious on the floor. He had whispered them to himself, to the bare walls, to the cold air around him. "I'll earn the money. I'll take care of it. I promise." But no one had heard him. No one had been there to hear. His mother had already gone. His father had drowned himself in liquor, and little Brennan had been left to walk into the streets alone, to fight alone, to survive alone. No one helped him. No one cared. Brennan turned away and walked back to the Audi parked at the curb. He opened the door and sat behind the wheel, but he didn't start the engine. He just sat there in the darkness of the cabin, his hands resting on the steering wheel without moving. No music, no sound, only the thick, suffocating silence and the pounding of his own heart inside his chest. He stared straight ahead at the old building, at the lit window on the 5th floor, where a 7-year-old little girl was promising her mother that tomorrow she would sell more bread, and for the first time in 20 years, something wet touched the corner of Brennan Cross's eye. A tear slid down his cheek, cold and salty. The first tear he had shed since he was 10 years old, since the night he ran away from his father's house and swore he would never be weak again. He didn't wipe it away. He let it fall. He let it run onto the collar of his expensive dress shirt. He let it remind him that he was still human, that somewhere deep inside the cold monster he had become, there was still a starving and lonely 7-year-old boy, still waiting for someone to come and help him. The next morning, Brennan Cross woke in a penthouse flooded with the pale light of dawn. He had barely slept at all the night before, yet strangely, he didn't feel tired. Instead, his mind felt clearer than it had in years, as if a thick layer of fog had finally been blown away by the wind, revealing things that had long been hidden from view. He sat on the edge of the bed for a while, looking toward the wall of glass where the winter sun was slanting in, washing the room in gold. Then he rose and walked into the dressing room. Today, he didn't choose one of the expensive suits he wore every day. No tie, no polished dress shoes, no Patek Philippe on his wrist, no silver Cross Syndicate ring on his hand. He dressed only in a simple long black coat, dark trousers, and a pair of comfortable leather shoes made for walking. He didn't call his driver. He didn't call Jared. He didn't tell a single person where he was going. Before leaving the room, he stopped in front of the large mirror and looked at his own reflection. The man looking back at him was still Brennan Cross, still that hard-cut face, still that swept-back black hair, still that tall, commanding frame, but there was something different in his eyes. His steel blue gaze was still sharp, but it was no longer cold as ice. There was something warmer there now, something gentler, as if the ice had begun, at last, to thaw. Brennan stepped out of Cross Tower and walked along the sidewalk in downtown Chicago. The December wind struck his face, and snow drifted down like white petals suspended in the air, but he didn't feel the cold. Or if he did, he didn't care. He walked with an even stride, passing office workers hurrying toward their jobs, passing storefronts opening their doors to the day, passing yellow taxis gliding along the street. No one recognized him. There was no gleaming black Maybach, no bodyguards trailing behind him, no aura of power surrounding him like armor. Today, he was only a man walking alone through the city. From a distance, he saw them. Two small figures standing at the familiar corner, near Cross Tower, still there, still holding on, as though they would remain in that spot forever, until every loaf had been sold, or until their mother got well. Brennan stopped about 10 meters away, standing beneath the shadow of a maple tree stripped bare by winter, and watched. Molly was smiling at a middle-aged woman passing by, lifting the basket of bread and offering it with hope. The woman stopped, looked at her, said something Brennan couldn't hear, then shook her head with a look of regret, and walked on. Molly didn't lose heart. She turned to the next passerby, the same bright smile still on her face, even though her cheeks were red from the cold and her lips had already turned purple. She kept asking, kept hoping, kept refusing to give up. Mason stood beside her, shoulders drawn tight against the cold, still carrying the bread basket with the loaves that remained. His eyes didn't search the faces of strangers the way his sisters did. He was always watching the world around them instead, alert to every possible danger that might come near. And then, as though some instinct warned him, the boy turned and looked straight toward where Brennan was standing. Those eyes met Brennan's steel blue gaze across the 10 meters between them, through the drifting snow and the stream of people moving past. Brennan stepped out from the shadow of the tree and began walking toward the children, one step at a time, slow and certain, the soft sound of his shoes striking the thin layer of snow on the sidewalk. He didn't hurry, he didn't hesitate. He simply walked with the calm, even pace of a man who had made a decision and had nothing left to think through. Mason recognized him at once, the man from the black car, the man who had ordered his driver to knock his sister's basket into the dirty snow. Instantly, the protective instinct rose in him again. He stepped sideways, placing himself between Brennan and Molly. His back straightened, his shoulders tightened, his eyes locked on Brennan without blinking. There was no fear in him, no trembling, only a fierce readiness to protect his sister at any cost, no matter who stood before him. Brennan stopped 2 steps away from the children. He looked at Mason, and Mason looked back at him. Their eyes met, a 33-year-old mafia boss and a 7-year-old boy, selling bread, standing at a crowded corner in downtown Chicago. No one spoke. Not a single word was said. Only the winter wind moved between them, carrying tiny snowflakes that drifted in the narrow space of those 2 short steps, a distance that somehow felt immeasurable. Molly stopped calling out to the crowd and looked curiously at the strange man standing in front of her brother. She tilted her head, as if trying to remember something. Around them, people kept walking past, paying no attention at all, unaware that a fateful reckoning was unfolding right there in the middle of the street. A taut, brittle silence settled over the small space between Brennan and the 2 children. He stood there, tall and dark as a shadow beneath the morning light, looking down at the little boy who had placed himself in front of his sister. Mason lifted his face and looked back at him, his eyes unblinking, steady, carrying not the slightest trace of fear, even though he was standing before the man who had knocked his sister's basket to the ground only a few days earlier. No one spoke. There was only the sharp whistle of the winter wind around the corner, the distant rhythm of footsteps passing by, and the pounding of 2 hearts, one grown and one small, facing each other in that charged stillness. People on the sidewalk began to notice the strange scene. A tall man, dressed simply yet unmistakably in expensive clothes, was standing face to face with 2 children selling bread in the cutting cold. Some slowed down to watch, curious and uncertain about what was happening. Some whispered to one another and pointed in their direction. A few recognized Brennan Cross's face, their eyes widening in disbelief before they hurried away as though afraid even their glance might pull them into something dangerous. Inside Morrison's Corner Cafe across the street, Clyde was pouring an Americano for a regular customer when he happened to glance up through the window. He recognized the man at once. That tall, commanding frame, that posture heavy with authority. Brennan Cross. Clyde's hand stopped over the steaming cup, and his dark brown eyes narrowed. What was the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago doing here? Why was he standing across from the same two children he had humiliated only days before? Brennan was the one who finally broke the silence. His voice was lower than usual, no longer cold as ice, carrying a different shade now, softer, though still firm. He asked how much one loaf of bread cost. Mason didn't answer right away. He remained where he was, his eyes fixed on Brennan, as if weighing him, measuring him, trying to understand what this man really wanted. A few silent seconds passed, long enough to feel like an entire lifetime. Then the boy spoke, his voice small yet hard as steel, filled with the fierce self-respect of a child who had been forced to grow up too fast. He said, "We're not begging, mister. We're just selling bread." Brennan went still for the briefest moment. Those words hit him like a blow to the center of his chest. Not painful, but enough to knock him off balance inside, because he had once said those exact same words. Many years ago, when he had been the abandoned child wandering the streets, when someone had tried to be kind to him, tried to offer him food or money, he had refused with those exact words, in that exact same proud and unyielding voice. He looked at Mason, and in the little boy he saw himself at 7 years old. Thin, poor, empty-handed except for his stubborn courage. But unwilling to bow, unwilling to accept pity, unwilling to let anyone look down on him. Brennan spoke again, his voice still deep, but different now. No longer an order, no longer a declaration, almost an explanation. He said that he didn't pity them. Mason didn't waver. He asked directly what Brennan wanted then, saying that the other day he had chased them away, so why had he come back now? It was a blunt question, sharp and straight, without fear, without hesitation, like an arrow striking the center of the target. A 7-year-old child was questioning the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, and there wasn't even the slightest tremor in his voice. Brennan fell silent. What did he want? He asked himself that same question and realized he didn't have a clear answer. He hadn't come there to buy bread, even though that was the excuse he could have used. He hadn't come there to prove anything, to display power or wealth. He didn't know what he wanted. He only knew he had to be there. He had to face these two children. He had to do something to quiet the thing that had been clawing at the inside of his chest for days. From behind Mason, Molly stepped out, too curious to stay hidden. She tilted her head and looked at Brennan with round eyes that held no fear at all, only the innocent curiosity of a child. She asked if he was the man from the other day, the one who had made her bread fall. There was no anger in her voice, no blame, no sadness. It was only a simple observation, as though she were asking about the weather or the color of his coat. Brennan looked at her, and his throat tightened. Those clear eyes, that smile still lingering on her lips even after the way she had been treated. That innocence life still hadn't managed to steal from her. He swallowed hard, then nodded. He admitted that yes, it had been him. And then Brennan did something no one expected, not even Brennan himself. He drew in a slow breath, filling his lungs with the smell of cold air and snow and the faint drifting scent of bread from the old wicker basket. He didn't hesitate. Forfeiting his pride and his tailored suit to the freezing mud, Brennan dropped to one knee. He ignored the gasps of the onlookers, his only world now existing in the eyes of the boy before him. He knelt until his eyes were level with Mason's gray ones. The whole street corner seemed to freeze in that instant. Passers-by stopped in their tracks and stared, unable to believe what they were seeing. Someone whispered in a trembling voice, asking if that was really Brennan Cross. Someone else nodded, eyes stretched wide as though witnessing something impossible. Brennan Cross, head of the Cross Syndicate, the man all of Chicago feared, was kneeling on the sidewalk before two 7-year-old children selling bread. Inside Morrison's Corner Cafe, Clyde stood motionless, the coffee in his hand long since gone cold. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He only stared through the window, eyes wide and fixed. For 20 years he had lived in Chicago. For 20 years he had heard the stories about Brennan Cross, about his cruelty and his power, about the enemies who had tried to make him bend and had all failed. In all those years, Clyde had never once heard of Brennan Cross kneeling before anyone, Not once. Not for any person. Not for any reason. And yet now, right before his eyes, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago was on one knee before two 7-year-old children selling bread, and Clyde knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was witnessing a moment that might never happen again. Brennan remained there on one knee, his knee pressed into the bitterly cold snow, dirty water soaking through the fabric of his expensive trousers. The hem of his black cashmere coat brushed the dusty sidewalk, but he didn't care. He didn't care at all about his clothes, about his image, about the eyes turning toward him from every direction. In that moment, his entire focus was on the gray eyes looking straight back at him, the eyes of the 7-year-old boy standing before him. Brennan spoke, his voice low and slow, each word seeming to be drawn from the deepest part of his chest. He said that he was apologizing, that what he had done the other day had been wrong. Those final words carried the weight of stone, as though they bore within them the full burden of 20 years of arrogance and coldness. I was wrong. They were 3 words Brennan Cross had never spoken to anyone in 2 full decades. He had been wrong many times. He had hurt many people, but he had never admitted it. He had never knelt. He had never spoken those words. Not until today. Mason stood there, looking at the man kneeling in front of him. The boy didn't fully understand everything that was happening, didn't understand why the powerful man from the black car a few days earlier was now kneeling before him in the middle of the street. But he could feel something. In Brennan's eyes, he no longer saw the cold contempt he had seen before. He saw something different now. Something softer. Something more real. As though a mask had finally been lifted away. The boy said nothing, but something in his gray gaze changed, became lighter, less guarded. He could feel that this man was telling the truth, that this wasn't a joke, wasn't cheap pity, but something real. Molly stepped out from behind her brother, too curious to stand still, and looked at the man kneeling at her eye level. She tilted her head, her wide round eyes fixed on Brennan without blinking, then spoke in the clear, ringing voice of a child. She said that her mother always told her that anyone who knows how to apologize is a good person. It was such a simple, innocent sentence, but it went straight into Brennan's chest like an arrow. A good person. Was he a good person? Had he ever been one in all his 33 years of life? Had he ever truly done something good for someone else without some benefit to himself? Brennan looked at the little girl, his mouth parting, but for several seconds, he couldn't say a word. His throat tightened, as though something had lodged there and wouldn't let him breathe. Brennan reached into the pocket of his coat, pulled out his wallet, and took every bill from inside. 5 $100 bills. He placed them into Mason's hand, his voice still low, but gentler than it had ever been. He told the boy to take it, to consider all the bread sold, and to use the rest to go buy medicine for his mother. Mason looked down at the money in his hand. $500. More than the boy had ever earned in an entire month of selling bread. He lifted his eyes to Brennan, his gray gaze flickering once, then shook his head. He said it was too much, that he couldn't accept it. Brennan looked at the boy and saw that fierce self-respect in those eyes, saw the reflection of himself at 7 years old, refusing every act of help with that exact same stubborn resolve. But he also remembered the hunger, the freezing nights, the desperate moments when he had wished someone would help him, and no one had. So he told the boy this wasn't pity money, it was money for the bread, and money with an apology, and the boy should take it. Mason hesitated. He looked at the money in his hand, looked at Brennan, then looked over at his sister, standing beside him with hope shining in her eyes. And then he remembered what Mr. Clyde had told him in the cafe a few days earlier. The strongest person isn't the one who never needs help, but the one who knows when to accept it. He looked back at Brennan, his eyes weighing the moment one last time. Then slowly, he nodded, and in a small but steady voice, he said, "Thank you." 3 simple words, yet it was the first time the boy had ever thanked this man. The first time he had opened his heart enough to receive something from Brennan Cross. Brennan rose to his feet, the knee of his trousers wet and stained, smeared with melted snow and sidewalk mud. He didn't brush it off. He didn't care. He looked at the 2 children, and his voice came out lower and warmer than it had at any other point in his life. He told them to go home, to take care of their mother, and that he would take care of the rest. Mason nodded. He didn't ask what Brennan meant by that. He didn't ask who Brennan really was. He simply nodded, took his sister's hand, lifted the basket of bread, and turned away. Molly had gone only a few steps before she looked back and waved at Brennan, her smile bright on her face, flushed red by the cold. She called out in a loud voice, "Goodbye, mister. You really are a good person." Brennan stood there, watching the two small figures walking away along the snow-covered sidewalk, farther and farther, until at last they disappeared behind the corner. He didn't know exactly what he was feeling. Something inside his chest was changing, as though a door that had been shut tight for 20 years had finally cracked open, allowing light to enter a room that had long been left in darkness. Behind him, the cafe door opened. Brennan didn't turn, but he heard footsteps coming closer. Clyde Morrison stopped beside him, and the two men stood there looking in the direction the children had gone. For a long while, neither of them said a word. There was only the hiss of the winter wind around the corner, and the far-off rhythm of footsteps passing by. Then Clyde spoke, his voice low and slow, carrying the weight of a man who had witnessed too much in his lifetime. He said that in 20 years of standing there, he had never once seen Brennan Cross kneel before anyone. Brennan didn't answer. He kept looking straight ahead, toward the place where the children had vanished. Clyde continued, his voice softer now, carrying a respect he had never before offered this mafia boss. He said that today he had seen it, and that he believed it was the bravest thing he had ever witnessed in his life. Brennan turned and looked at the old man, but said nothing. Yet in his eyes there was something different now, something softer, more human, as though the ice that had covered him for so many years were beginning to melt beneath the pale winter sun. He gave Clyde a small nod, a gesture of respect he had never offered anyone except those he considered his equal. Then he turned and walked away along the snow-covered sidewalk, heading back toward Cross Tower rising in the distance. Behind him, Clyde remained where he was, watching him go, a faint smile passing over the lined face of the old man. 1 week later, Northwestern Memorial Hospital, one of the finest hospitals in Chicago, received a new patient. Jenny Hartwell was brought there in a private ambulance and admitted to a private room with every comfort provided. The room was immaculate, its walls painted pure white without a single stain, the hospital bed made with crisp white sheets and soft pillows. Modern medical equipment stood neatly beside her, monitors blinking in steady rhythm with her heartbeat and vital signs. Gentle light streamed in through the large window, and beyond it lay the gray winter sky of Chicago. Yet inside the room everything was warm and safe. It was nothing like the damp apartment in the South Side, where mildew stained the walls and the heater had been broken since the month before. Jenny lay in the bed, wearing a clean hospital gown, an intravenous line running into her arm. Her fever had broken. Her skin was no longer as pale as it had been before, and her eyes were clearer, though still carrying traces of exhaustion. She looked around the room, still unable to understand what was happening. Just 1 week earlier, she had been lying in that miserable apartment with a raging fever, no money for medicine, and no idea what tomorrow might bring. Then her 2 children had come home with an amount of money she couldn't believe, telling her about the strange man who had knelt to apologize and bought all the bread. Then the ambulance had arrived, and the medical staff had told her that an anonymous benefactor had paid every expense, the hospital bill, the treatment, everything. She had asked the nurse who it was, but the nurse had only shaken her head and said they weren't allowed to reveal the name, that the person had insisted on remaining anonymous. Jenny lay there and looked at her 2 children sitting in the chairs beside her bed. Mason and Molly were eating sandwiches from the hospital cafeteria, their cheeks rosy again, no longer purple with cold, the way they had been on those days standing outside in the street. They were dressed in clean clothes, eating proper food, sitting in a warm room instead of shivering on a street corner. For the first time in many months, Jenny felt that she could breathe, that she could sleep without fear of tomorrow, without fear of medicine costs, rent, or what would happen to her children if she were gone. The doctor entered the room, a middle-aged man with a gentle face and gold-rimmed glasses. He checked the readings on the monitors, reviewed her chart, then sat down beside her bed. In a calm and careful voice, he explained that her kidney disease was chronic, but if it was treated properly and consistently, it could absolutely be controlled. He told her that she would need regular dialysis and medication exactly as prescribed, but she wasn't going to die from this illness. She would live. She would recover. She would be able to raise her children. She would have a future. Jenny listened, and tears began to slide down her cheeks. Not tears of misery like the ones she had shed in the long, dark months before, but tears of relief, of hope reborn, of someone who had walked through hell and suddenly caught sight of light. She pulled her children into her arms and wept without a sound, her shoulders trembling. For the first time in a very long while, she was crying from happiness. Molly didn't understand why her mother was crying. She only wrapped her arms around her mother and comforted her in that clear little voice, telling her not to cry, that she was going to get better, that she was absolutely sure of it. Mason sat beside them without saying a word, but his eyes were red as well, and he laid his small hand over his mother's and held on tightly, as though he never wanted to let go. At Cross Tower, in the vast office on the 39th floor, Brennan Cross sat behind his desk listening to Jared's report. Jared stood in front of him with a thin stack of papers in his hand, his voice as calm as it always was during business briefings. He said that she had been admitted, that the doctor said her outlook was good, that the illness could be managed, and that the 2 children were staying with her at the hospital. Brennan nodded and said very little, only staring out the glass wall at Chicago spread beneath him. Jared hesitated for a moment, then asked if his boss wanted to go see them, so they would know who had helped them. Brennan shook his head immediately, his voice short and flat, saying there was no need, that they should simply be left in peace and not disturbed. Jared nodded and turned to leave, but when he reached the door, he stopped and looked back at Brennan. His voice was different from usual, softer, more sincere. He said, "Boss, I think you did the right thing." Brennan didn't answer. He kept looking out the window, but Jared saw his shoulders slacken slightly, as though some hidden burden had finally been set down. Jared stepped out and closed the door behind him, leaving Brennan alone with his thoughts. That afternoon, Brennan left Cross Tower without calling for a car and without bringing bodyguards. He walked along the downtown sidewalk, past people hurrying home, past storefronts preparing to close, until he reached a small cafe on the corner, Morrison's Corner. He pushed the door open, and the little bell above it rang softly. Inside, the cafe was warm with the familiar scent of roasted coffee, and a few customers were scattered among the tables. Brennan walked straight to the counter and sat on one of the high stools. Clyde was behind the bar, polishing a glass. The old man looked up when he heard the footsteps, and his deep brown eyes met Brennan's steel blue ones. There was no surprise, no hesitation, only a slight nod, like one man greeting another he already knew. Clyde asked simply if he wanted black coffee. Brennan nodded and answered just as briefly, "Yes." Clyde turned away and made the coffee with the slow, practiced movements of someone who had done this for decades. He set the steaming cup in front of Brennan, then remained there polishing the glass, saying nothing. Neither of them spoke for a while. There was only the soft drift of jazz from the speakers, the clink of cups against saucers from the other customers, and the rich smell of coffee in the air. Clyde was the first to speak, his voice low and unhurried, as though he were talking about the weather. He said he had heard that the young woman had been admitted, that it was a good hospital. Brennan took a sip of coffee, the familiar bitterness spreading over his tongue, but he didn't answer. Clyde went on, direct and unguarded, saying that for years he had hated Brennan, hated him and his organization, hated what he did, and that there wasn't a single part of it he could agree with. Brennan lifted his eyes to the old man. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He only listened with a face that gave nothing away. Clyde looked straight into Brennan's eyes, and his voice changed, softer now, though still plain-spoken. He said that on that day, when he saw Brennan kneel before those 2 children, he thought maybe there was still something left in him, something that hadn't died completely. Brennan set the cup down on the counter, his fingers brushing the rim, and spoke in a low, slow voice. He said he didn't know what kind of man he was anymore, that he had become what life had made him, no more and no less. Clyde nodded, as though he understood better than most. He said he had been the same way, that war had turned him into something he had never wanted to become, had made him do things he never wanted to remember, but that even so, every morning a man still had a choice. Every morning he could still choose who he would be. Brennan said nothing, only looked down at the coffee slowly cooling in front of him. Clyde continued, his voice gentler now, almost like encouragement. He said that on that day Brennan had made the right choice, and that he believed Brennan could keep choosing what was right, if he wanted to. Brennan didn't answer. He finished the last of his coffee, set down more money than the price of a single cup, and rose to his feet. Then he walked toward the door, but just before he stepped out, he stopped and turned to look at Clyde, and he nodded, a small gesture, but one filled with meaning, the first true sign of respect he had ever given the old man behind the bar. Clyde nodded in return, and a faint smile passed across his lined face. Brennan pushed the door open, the bell chimed softly behind him, and he disappeared into the moving crowd of the winter afternoon. 1 year later, in Wicker Park, Chicago, one of the city's rising neighborhoods, filled with charming cafes, art shops, and tree-lined streets, a small bakery stood quietly on the corner, among the busy storefronts. Its rustic wooden sign read, "Hartwell's Bread, fresh bread daily." The spotless glass windows reflected the gentle light of winter, and from inside came the warm, drifting scent of newly baked bread, calling to people on the street and inviting them to stop. Jenny Hartwell stood behind the counter, busy with loaves that had just come from the oven. She looked far healthier than she had a year earlier, her face no longer hollow and pale, but glowing now with life and color. Her eyes shone brightly. Her chestnut brown hair was tied neatly at the nape of her neck, and her hands moved quickly as she wrapped bread for customers, a warm smile resting on her lips. She still kneaded the dough with her own hands every morning at 4 o'clock. She still baked, according to her grandmother's secret recipe, the same recipe that had carried her family through the hardest days of their lives. The bakery was small, with only a few tables and a modest register counter, but it was always full. People came for the bread, for the irresistible aroma, and for the story. The story of the 2 children who had once sold bread on the street had spread through the neighborhood and become a small legend that everyone wanted to hear. Mason and Molly were 8 now, taller, stronger, and happier. They attended a good elementary school near their home. They had new books, friends, and the kind of childhood children were meant to have. Mason was still quieter than most, still carried that thoughtful seriousness that made him seem older than his years. But he smiled more now, and the gray eyes that once had been heavy with worry no longer carried the same burden. He still took his father's old navy blue backpack to school every day. The bag was more worn now, more faded than before, but he never agreed to replace it. It was a keepsake, the thread that still tied him to the father he had lost. Molly was just as lively as ever, still quick to laugh, still full of words, still the bright energy at the center of their family. She still hugged Mr. Buttons every night before falling asleep. The old teddy bear had been carefully stitched and mended by her mother, fitted with a new eye and stuffed full again, but he was still her dearest friend. On the wall of the bakery, just behind the cash register, Jenny had hung a small frame. Inside it wasn't a photograph, but a $100 bill, one of the 5 bills Brennan had placed in Mason's hand on the day everything changed. Beneath the frame, Jenny had written a single line herself in black ink on white paper. The day everything changed. Many customers grew curious and asked about the bill, why anyone would frame money, what it meant. Jenny would only smile and say it was a long story, then return to her work and leave the rest to their imagination. Every Saturday afternoon, one man came to the bakery. He sat in the far corner by the window overlooking the street, ordered 1 fresh loaf of bread and 1 cup of black coffee. He didn't talk much to anyone. He didn't draw attention to himself. He simply sat there in silence, eating the bread slowly, taking measured sips of coffee, gazing out the window with a thoughtful look in his eyes. Sometimes, his gaze drifted toward the counter, where Jenny moved busily among the customers, where the 2 children sometimes came running in after school, their laughter echoing through the little shop. A new employee, a young woman hired only the month before, once asked Jenny about the mysterious man, asked whether she knew him and why he came there every week. Jenny looked toward the far corner, and her expression softened. Then she answered gently that she did know him, but he shouldn't be disturbed. Jenny had found out. After leaving the hospital, after life had begun to settle into something steady again, she had taken the time to learn who it was that had helped her family, and she had found the answer: Brennan Cross. A name that made many people in the city tremble. A name whispered in stories about Chicago's underworld. But Jenny wasn't afraid, and she never once walked over to greet him, never once thanked him directly. Not because she wasn't grateful, but because she understood he didn't want thanks. He didn't come there to be thanked. He came to look at an ordinary family, happy and whole, a healthy mother, 2 joyful children, a peaceful life, the very thing he himself had never had. And each Saturday, she gave him that. That Saturday afternoon, Brennan sat in his usual corner, half a loaf of bread left on the plate, the coffee in his hand already gone cool. The bakery door swung open, and the 2 children came running in, backpacks on their shoulders, laughter spilling through the little shop. Mason and Molly rushed toward their mother behind the counter, talking over each other as they told stories about school, about friends, about a test they had done well on. Jenny bent down and wrapped her arms around them, smiling with all the brightness in the world, asking them a dozen questions at once. From the corner of the bakery, Brennan watched it all, and the edge of his mouth lifted into a faint smile, a rare smile, the kind very few people had ever seen on the face of the cold boss of the Cross Syndicate. He remembered himself at 7, the child abandoned by his mother, beaten by his father, hungry and wandering through the streets, swearing to himself that he would become strong no matter the cost, that he would never be weak again. And he had become strong. He had gained everything: money, power, the fear of others, an underground empire stretching across Chicago. But never, not once, had he felt anything like this, the feeling of belonging somewhere, even if only in a small corner of a humble bakery, the feeling of having done something right, truly right, not for profit or power, but simply because it was the right thing to do. Brennan rose from his seat and left money on the table, far more than the price of bread and coffee, just as he always did. He put on his coat and walked toward the door. But before stepping out, he paused and turned back for one last look at the bakery. He looked at the $100 bill framed on the wall. He looked at the words, "The day everything changed." He looked at the 2 children laughing with their mother behind the counter. And he smiled. A small smile, but one filled with quiet satisfaction. Then he pushed the door open and stepped outside into the Chicago winter afternoon, where the snow was falling lightly once more. People often say that the strongest man is the one who never bows his head, but perhaps they're wrong. Perhaps the strongest man isn't the one who never kneels, but the one who has the courage to kneel when he realizes he was wrong. And sometimes, it is the smallest children, the most innocent souls, who teach us the greatest lesson in courage. Because true courage isn't the absence of fear, it's feeling fear and still doing what is right. It is kneeling when it's needed. It is admitting a mistake when it must be admitted. It is changing while there is still time left to change. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share this video with the people you love, so that together we can continue listening to moving stories each day. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment below and share what is stirring deep in your heart. We would truly love to hear your thoughts. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Thank you for staying with us. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.